All right, here it is, folks. The reason why I am in my study talking to you and not at the Bible study. It has been snowing. It has been snowing hard. I know you guys all know that. But I thought those of you who are further away from East Providence would prefer to hear that in person. So today we are going to have a telecommuting Bible study. It's going to be fun. First thing I want to show you right now is a book called Lost Scriptures, Books That Did Not Make It into the New Testament. Why do I show you this? Well, first of all, for amusement value, because it kind of makes getting into the New Testament sound like a beauty pageant, and that certain books just didn't cut it. And it's like, I didn't get into the New Testament, I didn't get into Yale, I didn't even get into UMass Boston. I really feel bad about myself. You get the idea. It's almost as if I took this commentary on Proverbs and subtitled it Books That for some reason didn't make it into the complete writings of William Shakespeare. But the subtitle of this book actually encapsulates the idea, an idea that's very current right now. And that is the idea that the New Testament was sort of written, collected by people who had an agenda, who excluded a number of equally valid books on the grounds that they didn't fit with that agenda. And so that's what we're going to look at today. And this is a big deal right now. Excuse me while I continually adjust the camera and the computer and stuff. All right. It's a big deal today because there are a lot of books like the Da Vinci Code, which I don't recommend reading, not because it'll turn you into a heretic, but because it'll waste 3 to 6 hours of your life as it did mine. But also the Gospel of Judas, which is a fairly ancient book, which was recently translated by and translated and published with great fanfare by the National Geographic Society, and all sorts of people who, in sort of a lower key pop history way, promote the idea that the New Testament's portrayal of Jesus is not completely reliable, and that in fact it was collected with a major agenda in place. So what I want to try to do today is I want to go through what we do know about how we can do all the New Testament books and all of the books that sort of resemble the New Testament books, but we can talk about the Gospels, and we can talk about non-canonical, that is, the ones that didn't make it into the canon, contenders with the canonical Gospels. Okay, so that's clear as mud, but we'll get to it in a second. Things to know before we start out talking about things like the Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Judas, the Secret Gospel of Mark, the Gospel of Peter, the Gospel of Mary, the Proto-Evangelium of James, the Achmim Gospel, the Oxyrhynchus Papyri, etc., is what does scholarship tell us about how and when the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were actually written. So things to know. First of all, we're only talking about AD here, so I'm not going to say AD and BC. Just it's all after the birth of Christ. Jesus ministered in the late 20s or early 30s. The dates of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John are agreed upon by scholars, even scholars who don't really have very much trust in the truth of the New Testament, to within about 50 years. Now, pretty reasonable consensus tells us the Gospel of Mark was written sometime in the 50s or 60s AD. The Gospels of Matthew and Luke were written 10 to 20 years after the Gospel of Mark. We also, well, we'll get to this in a second, but the Gospel of John was written probably in the 90s AD. Some scholars think even later, but of course if you get too late, then you get out of the possible lifespan of the Apostle John, and personally, I don't accept that. So, but at least the 90s AD. Even conservative scholars who really take the Bible seriously, believe what it says, believe John when he talks about Jesus and everything that Jesus said and did, they don't think, for the most part at least, that John wrote any time before 90 AD, so it was very late in the first century. there's an accepted genealogy also of the canonical Gospels, a sense in which, or an understanding of how they relate to each other and where they came from. And especially of interest are the first three Gospels, what are usually called the Synoptic Gospels. So you have Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Now of those, as I said before, Mark is the first one. A couple decades later, Matthew and Luke, and we don't know when they each wrote. Okay, we don't know who wrote first. I think probably Matthew wrote first, and then and then Luke wrote later. The reason for that is Luke says many have endeavored to give an account of the things that have happened at the beginning of his gospel. So I think probably what happened is this: Mark wrote. A couple decades later, Matthew and Luke both wrote with more information than Mark had. Mark wrote based upon first-hand accounts. He himself was not an eyewitness. And he does not write like an eyewitness. He writes like somebody who's been talking to eyewitnesses, and his number one source is almost certainly the Apostle Peter. We know from the New Testament itself and also from resources outside of the New Testament that, that Mark and Peter were very closely associated with each other. We've talked about that in other settings before. Matthew and Luke both have some information that Mark doesn't have. First of all, they have additional first-hand accounts. But, and this is what makes them very much alike, Matthew and Luke, they have a block of information or a set of information, including things like the Beatitudes, blessed are the meek, blessed are the poor in spirit, etc., that Mark doesn't have. And that block of sayings, that block of doings, excuse me, warm day inside, but it's a cold day outside. All of those sayings and doings that Matthew and Luke have are known to scholars as, get this, Q. That's right, Q. Let that sink in for a minute. It's not as mysterious as it sounds. That's just short for an old German word, Quelle, which is the German word for source or spring. And this is a word that scholars came up with in order to describe this source that Matthew and Luke both have that Mark doesn't have. Now, it could have been written. I think it probably was a written source that they were both relying on. But also, it could have been oral history. It could have been simply a widely accepted body of things that Jesus said and did that were both very well known to Matthew and Luke. And they both make use of that material along with Mark, and they also add their own information that Mark doesn't have, and that they don't have, or that, you know, Luke has stuff that Matthew doesn't have, and Matthew has stuff that Luke doesn't have. Okay? Especially Luke has some information that Matthew doesn't have. That's what you see over and over again. They'll also do a certain amount of editing, rearranging, adding some things that Jesus said that the other people don't have, changing things up a little bit so that we have a better sense of how it really happened. And each one is writing with a different purpose. So Matthew has a huge interest in trying to show how Jesus fulfilled the Old Testament promises. Luke has a huge interest in showing the significance of everything that's gone on for history, not just in the past, but in what's going to happen after the time of Jesus. Pretty cool stuff, which is why I'm excited that we're going through the Gospel of Luke now. I'm just getting to the end of this video, and I'll pick it up in a second.